I was thinking about the year 2020 itself and how I could be more responsible over that year now. And I am in 2022, it is mid-July, and I'm thinking about, in a history perspective from the future tense, if someone were to look back in their history records as a researcher, as someone looking for answers, that they would want to have a clear grasp and understanding of what happened and why things happened the way they did and what kind of events took place. And I think this is important from my perspective because it was very unique, and it's, in all honesty, my view of it comes from a very controversial place. And I say that it comes from a place that is extraterrestrial, so it's not a perspective that comes from the planet itself. Now, if I were to kind of give an extrapolation, the overview of what I sense happened, I think in a lot of ways what we had done as a species, we had in our doctoral pursuits for optometry identified a specific code for our perfect vision, and that was the 20/20 vision. And in a synchronicity at the same time, we're one planet, and we are very, I think, self-centered in the sense that what we look for in other planets is going to be exactly like ours, where we look for the oxygen environment with water. And so we've built our concept of where life can exist based off of that perspective. And in reality, life can exist everywhere, and especially in other climates that don't even have oxygen. So that is a really key component, that we had a vision going into 2020 that we were still the center of our Earth, the center of our planet in all its existence, because when we looked and peered outside of it, we see stars and we see light, and we've built our instruments to detect those, but we haven't recognized life forms yet, consciously, honestly, and into a state that it was part of our education system. So we denied it, essentially, to all degrees. We weren't teaching that life forms were visiting us, and we weren't teaching that we were living in a cohabitation. And we also weren't addressing the realities that we had our own documentation that had basically completely stated otherwise. So we went into 2020 with a leadership vision, I think, and we had placed on the front of our companies and corporations that to be successful, to run the parts of the ground that were necessary, we have to guide each of our businesses and corporations with a guiding vision through psychology, through executive leadership and coaching. All parts of corporations and companies and businesses and organizations have a guiding vision, and that's what they used. And simultaneously, we had a hedge set for the year 2020 itself, and that was a bit of actualization. So if you look back earlier from 2020 and go through all the documentation for corporations, you more likely than not would find that they had placed a great emphasis on that year itself. In a parallel to the health in the field of optometry and eye health, ocular health, we had placed so much emphasis that that was a critical component that we had validated all of those who had perfect vision as, in essence, perfect leaders, because they had those visions set and they had their own health to reflect that through our doctoral knowledge. And when 2020 came around, something completely different happened, and we were not prepared for it. So that's a step up to the year. Now, from my perspective now in 2022, I say a lot of different things happened, and I don't think it is any one individual species fault. And I say that because I don't think it's a human fault. I don't think it is a specific species of extraterrestrial fault. And I wouldn't even put it on a specific coding platform's fault. So from my perspective, a lot of different things happen in a very different way. So on the globe here, we get through January and February, and by the end of February, the whole planet is reeling from this perceived virus, and everyone has to go home and the world is shut down. And if we look now in my current year, 2022, in July, a couple very key important events have just taken place. I think the first one was actually inspired earlier on because of key legislation that was passed in Congress in 2020 or 2021 about the disclosure of information of unidentified aerial phenomenon or UFO presence. And that was fascinating that it made it onto a piece of legislation, but it immediately gained traction. And I think that guides into the evolving perception that we gained here on planet Earth. So what happened? Well, in the end of 2020 or end of 2021, they had, I'm going to say it was 2021, they had established a office in the Pentagon again for identifying unidentified aerial phenomenon, and the main component was that they had to destigmatize it. There was so much faith and belief built up around the concept of extraterrestrial life existing because of a psychological that sense of powerlessness of admitting to being maybe a subspecies to another species was so powerful within the minds of those who had been observing unidentified aerial phenomenon that they mocked it, and they would essentially refute the evidence and deny it and tell people that had these witness experiences to be quiet about it. And that was actually the biggest fault, I think, to the whole experience we had here, is that we didn't have clarity into what we were dealing with, what environment we were actually on here on planet Earth. So that was an introduction, and later on in this year of 2022 that I am in, they further went to elaborate on some of the details, and it was not telling because it was in the same protective sense that to maintain the advantage or perceived advantage of technological capacity above the ground level of Earth between other human beings, they restrict and classify the knowledge from the United States side, and that was disclosed by the Pentagon. And then shortly after that, what happened was the Brazilian congressional UFO hearing. And in Brazil, I think the tradition is actually somewhat different because they're South American and they are more telling and more open as a society. And so it was a very different narrative. They're also a smaller country, but they were as open as they could be, I believe. And even in some of their statistical knowledge, they were sharing that more of their population had the active held belief that extraterrestrials visit the Earth, and that was a regular phenomenon. And so those two events happened now only 2 years after the COVID incident that is actually still present on the planet in different variants or perceived variants. So we're in a state where we're diving into another concept that we're not the only species visiting the planet. And so if we go through some of the examples that Brazil had provided for us, it completely opens up this whole perspective that we've been observing vehicles and beings that were not human and don't possess the same technological capacity, and their equipment is far superior to humans, and we have no concrete evidence of this because likely they remove their craft from the planet when they choose to. And so that opened up a whole new frame of reference here only a few years after. Now, if I go back to 2020, the year itself, and identify it from my perspective, a lot of those truths that the Earth is figuring out today were already very much solidified in my mind because of the experiences I had. And I think I mentioned before there was multiple incidences when I was living in the downtown Seattle area with extraterrestrial presence and that cognition of the psionic activity and the activation of the two lobes of the brain together, and also a communication channel that was just very visual in the brain, and very much like a piece of machinery. So if you were a historian looking back on this day and you were looking at what happened in 2021, Jesse, it's in 2020 and 2019, it's a tough reality because in all honesty, what I experienced was simply it's autonomous, it's extraterrestrial technology, but it's very equivalent to our modern day artificial intelligence algorithms. I think it is a type of hybrid technology because I think it's both adapted to human technology systems, and I think it's also adapted to likely numerous extraterrestrial species. But in my experience in 2019 in November, when the initial activation sequence for my psionic heads-up display, and I would really call that the first initial contact because it was very much a guided process, and later on through learning about the autonomous systems and algorithmic systems that are prevalent on the Earth here, you learn a lot about what's guiding us, what in the subconscious sense we think is our natural intuition. But if we have only lived on one planet our whole life, the concept of that intuition being a guided, chosen movement is not necessarily conscious to us, and that's really what it is. We live on the earth, but we are visited by other species, and these species are most definitely in command and in control of the human species, because we are not leaving the earth readily. We are not at that place in our evolution where our technology allows us to leave the solar system, where other species can leave the solar system if they've already reached that level of advancement. So in November, I think it was made obvious that there was a convergence of our visualization, that we had believed optometry to such a high degree that that vision for our 2020 year was already perfect, and it was just going to be a celebration. But it wasn't. When they, and I'll say extraterrestrials, were looking at the information that they've collected from the entire planet, from their visualization centers, the memory centers. And I would move to the place for anyone listening to this to recognize that they have their technology to the degree where they can download a brain. They can just download a brain and put it on a computer and read the information like you would install a program or something. So they can do that to the whole planet, and they use the same kind of tools to decipher and figure out what the state of the species is and what the best course of action is and what to do with that information. But the information that they pulled is everything that we have visualized. So all of the video games and TV watching and movies and things that we are very much privileged to experience, but we also only experience them from the ground level here, do not necessarily choose with the most discernment. We are very much fed entertainment rather than how we are creating our entertainment. So that was a big issue, and a lot of different programs and platforms showed up, and specifically in the vision for space, they are continually looking for the highest vision of space, because that's when they look at all of the memory sets for the planet, they're looking at what is the highest vision for your species trying to live outside of your solar system. And that vision that we had was corrupted entirely. It was completely unsustainable. From their vision, it looked as an attack, actually, because it depicted nothing but violence. And so on the collective psyche, I think they just let that reciprocate and just let the earth figure it out. But it most definitely manifests itself in a virus. But the virus, I don't think people are comprehending, it's not an organic virus. It's not a piece of something that nature's produced. It's a program. So the virus itself, I observed in November in 2019, and I think by the time it had spread to the rest of the planet, it was essentially there to be a learning tool, and it's a terrible thing because of the volume of life we lost. But if you were taking samples from a planet and you had to figure out the most sensitive circuitry, the most sensitive pathing of their existence, you have to watch what happens. You have to observe carefully and see how everything is unfolding. So as we're going through this process here, and in the parts of the psionic display, it became very apparent. You can see little programs and applications, and it's an adaptation. So it's essentially, more of the species will become conscious of this adaptation that you'll likely use outside of the solar system. But when you're first getting introduced to it, it's going to pull all of that information from every single person's memory center to try to visualize what your next step is. So it was calculating the 2020 vision. It was calculating the 2020 vision and the vision of space going ahead, and trying to put that into a constructive concept between two parts of our planet that we're observing: the part of the planet that exists without the psionic technology and the overlay, and the part of the planet that most definitely exists with that part of the brain activated. And it's an overlay. It's a whole planet on top of another planet that interacts with technology. In a higher evolved life form that travels between different planets, they've likely already evolved something similar to that degree. And I think in many CIA documentations and FBI documentations, and even some of the examples from the Brazilian UFO disclosure, they were explaining that many of the vehicles that they witness by personnel on both countries have knowledge of the interaction of telepathic communication between the vehicles, as if the occupants that drive the vehicles are not necessarily driving the vehicles with a seat. It's driven with the mind, as in the brain is just interacting with the vehicle. When you think a thought, the vehicle moves, because that's the type of technology they are accustomed to. It's just more fitting and comfortable. And the same thing is true with the psionic technology. Is it's a heads-up display, but it's there to interact with the environment. So as that part is developing and becoming more conscious, into 2020, I think is what we ran into is the creativity aspect, because the human mind held this degree of competition and creativity, but the visualizations were derived in such a deficit of human health itself that all that they could generate from their brains was viral. So it was this concept, and you could see it if you are coming from the future, looking back onto the sociology and psychology of the people this time, you would find even in documents and records that through the media outlets, the types of television that they were watching, that there was this central component around this concept that when something is viral, that it was good, that it was to be pleasing because they found it would contain the most audience members. So it was used improperly from a verbal sense, but they had not comprehended that when the brain starts to project through that psionic system that's interacting with the environment, it does the exact same thing. So if the goal for the human species was to create something that was viral on a larger scale, that's exactly what they accomplished, but that was the fault. That was the demise here. So it's a terrible circumstance, but it was observed from my perspective, and that is essentially what is still carried out. So a part of the human psyche is stuck in a cycle of autonomous, automated competition, but the cognition of what that psychology of the competition of one human life over another, it doesn't have recourse or recall or even any sense of responsibility or degree, because it's a machine. The part of the human mind is integrated into a machine algorithm. So now, moving on from that initial observation that there is humans evolving into a hybrid state that is interacting with a multitude of machine algorithms. From my own perspective, many different things became clear, because it was not the virus itself that I was affected by, because I can look physically at the vitals screen on the heads-up display and just tell that it's not something I'm visualizing. And the other components, I had work to accomplish. The entire year was actually spent doing crystal energy circuitry readings because of where the stem from the psionic circuitry within the planet spectrum rerouted itself to any, it really could be any central location that had technology advancements because of the hybridization, both human technology and extraterrestrial technology existing on a level together. You could probably find in any major city or co-location tower or large data bank that you are going to have this kind of technology. It could be an interference, but it can also be a direct communication. So from the heads-up display, I was given plenty of information and I think authority to communicate back and forth between the extraterrestrial platforms themselves and also the human AI platforms and the hybrid platforms between the human AI and extraterrestrial AI. So it's a multitude, but I was given tasks. So 2020 only happened once, but what we had to do was take immense amount of readings and samplings because that is the definitive visionary year. So again, if you're coming from the future reading this or hearing this, looking back, trying to figure out what happened in 2020, the year itself is pivotal for the next century in essence, until we get to the next set of 20. So 2030 or 2120 to 2129 would be the next set. So what I found was in this process, everyone had gone back home because they had curfew, and I had to figure out how the overlay on the simplest level, and again, I'm using crystals essentially as a tool, crystals as a tool to perform readings, and because the crystals also directly interact with the parts of the brain that is creating frequency and patterning parts of the Earth's surface that we don't really calculate on a day-to-day basis because of its practical use, is very unobservable. But what you can gather from that is a great amount of information from the right brain itself, the color patterning. And here on the planet Earth today, the majority of people are right-handed, and left-handed is quite rare, probably in the 1% range. But that says something about both the brain dominance itself and also the integration of cognition of balance. So I was born left-handed and never thought anything of it, and later on I began to use my right hand and became ambidextrous and can use both now. But the actual study of the brain itself is fascinating because what appears after psionic activation, cognition, recognition that you're interacting with both machine technology and extraterrestrial technology, and likely the extraterrestrials themselves, is that you're being guided. So I've mentioned you see the little blue lights, and when you see those, you need to comprehend that you're being driven. In essence, there's a multitude of programs and algorithms that are used to control the positioning of the head, the movement of the hands, where you walk. Essentially, all those systems are just calculated, very simple. The brain's put on a platform, the platform has adaptations and control mechanisms, and then they can drive little people around on the planet as they will. And it's usually to teach something. If some of them aren't operated manually, then everything is autonomous though. So that is where we run into an issue. If the autonomous programming is educated, then it's functional. If it's not educated, then it can have plenty of dysfunction. So it has a machine learning scale to it. So what did I discover? Well, taking samples and energy samples in 2020, again, it's this small window, the visionary window that we have to take sample readings from a couple different energy sources. One is going to be the for the right brain, it's that orange patterning, and we talked about that before. It's related to, it can be related, but does not have to be related to chakras, even if you just used it as the color science, the color orange itself, though you could find that in the human DNA. So that's important. And the other aspect is the psychological patterning. We were looking at the visionary component because the year 2020 itself, through doctoral knowledge, was providing this perfect vision. But you can even tell just by reading out the word 2020 that doesn't necessarily have balance to it. If the 2 is on the left and the 0 is on the right, then we are obviously not looking in one direction that's going to be balanced. We're kind of going either to the left or to the right. If it was 2 2 2 2, or the 2 was a symmetrical character like an A or something, that would be more accurate to a perfect vision because there would have been some balance to it. But obviously it was scalar in one side. So that says something about the health of the human brain right there, the psychology, where they came up with that concept, at least in the English language, should be recognized. That's a really important event. The brain patterning and how we display that has a huge component. And that's not very hard to conceive, considering that the planet's spinning in one direction, we're orbiting in one direction, that everything we're doing is just going to have a one direction to it. But that doesn't necessarily exude the perfection and vision. It could be close to a vision that is helpful for land sight, but to create some form of balance, I think we would need other terminology from a fundamental state. So if I go through the year itself, I gathered as much information as I could, tried to figure out key significant people, and specifically because I'm using energy circuitry through crystals, a lot of meditation. And there's a beautiful spot here in Redmond, and I'll probably show a video later on about a meditation spot, but it was you'll find there's only really one in Redmond here, and it's that root chakra center. Or if you're not relating it to that, it's simply a nice little seat with some quiet places to relax the mind. But I was doing plenty of AP activation and crystal energy work there during the year, gathering information from the people that were still about in the city, and deciphering what it is that we were going to look at for the future ahead. So 2022 became very explicitly defined that we were going to have energy waves in February, and so I had to compile all this information. And in the fall of 2020, I had written it was actually a handwritten letter to the Pentagon describing all of my findings. So that was the first tip that we had, or at least I had gathered, in the concept of communicating this to my government. And I hopefully and ideally and can tell already that that's had some influence in their perspective and how they've developed it. But I was very explicit describing that the events in February of 2022 were going to be an energy peak that was deconstructive, and there's not much we could do about it, or so many reasons, because of the psychological brain patterning. Now, the second, and I think even more critical component that I highlighted is still yet to come, and I don't actually know what else to approach it with, because the truth of the matter is it's a convergence of, again, multiple platforms of the human psychology through this semi-cognitive in the majority of people, the semi-cognitive psionic state. That is the year 2023 in January 1st. And that is because of a multitude of different things. And if I look at it from a distance, you're not going to think much of it. It just looks like the year. The year seems simple. But again, in 2020, we had to take these samples, and a lot of things popped up, specifically signs, and they're just very discreet, explicit. Obviously, I can tell when I see the little blue light, something is turning my head, or I get an audio communication, Jess, you need to look at this. This is what we're trying to look at on your planet. What is this? Why is this here? What does this say to you? Because they're trying, the AI communication is trying to use deciphering measures to figure out the landscape of the globe. Obviously, many of them are coming from different planets and not from this one. So trying to figure out why things are the way they are requires a little bit more in-depth looking. But if we look, and I'll leave a link here in the description to a predictive chart I've made on the Reddit page under the Vishuddha chakra. And it spans out, I think I've written it to almost maybe like 10,000 years. But I haven't actually put all the predictive dates in. But if you follow the simple A to Z, we have our 126. So 23 is really important because it's the first W year that we are going to have in this century. And the thing about the W year is, again, a hybridization of the human mind in a manifestation. So what we have done is created this internet platform on our human non-active psionic field that is a .com system, and that is just a simple search engine, but the people have been using it repeatedly since its creation, probably some 50 or maybe 60 years ago. It could be less, actually. The actual website system may have come up in maybe 89 or early 90s. But that whole data set of information, every single time that a person had logged a .com system into their brain, or in this sense where we have autonomous systems uploading human brains onto server equipment, that's a stored set of information. So all the visualizations for websites, data collecting through every single person's lifespan has been put on a W key system. And if we go, another high tell was actually the keyboard itself. If you go look at the organization, we have the left ring finger was the W key, and you might think that's adorable, and it's true that that is a fascinating component. And the ring finger itself has been highly used for so many reasons, but at the same time it also sits a nice little crystal on it, and has always done that for the people who have enjoyed marriage. At the same time, the finger itself, the left ring finger, is the closest one to the heart itself if you look at the nerve endings and vessels all the way. So it's a really important finger on the hand, but it's also a driving tool. So we've been pressing that W key for many decades now and amassing a large volume of visualization from website data collecting. Now, on the side of the brain that an active person with psionic brain integration would experience on the planet Earth, we have the overlay concept. So that's the computerized Earth that sits on top of the human Earth, that is a hybridization of our technology and our brain evolving. And most people will not experience this or see it, but it exists. And what it exists, though, is is a state of its degradation. It's a very corrupt system because it has gathered the information from the computation of video gaming and the computation of movie watching, and anything that gets put into code goes on to a platform that gets refed back into the human brain and body. So that's actually a real concern. If we go look even at some of the applications of computer use, we immediately find there's an entire scale of the majority of people who are using computers and what they're using them for. So that system, the computerized Earth system, it does have plenty of tools. Say there's applications used for measuring stock markets, things to drive your car, multitudes of things. They'll make your coffee, design a pair of shoes for you, through all sorts of medical industries, brilliant things. But if we look at the heavier side of it, the majority of the programming gets done by computer game users. So that is actually the main cautionary concern, is that year activates a significant, as in the largest component of human psychology that has ever used a computer. And I don't actually have much else I want to say about it, because I am 5 months out from that date, and I am still working on trying to design what kind of preventative measures I can to protect my planet, my globe, and further evolve my species all around. So I will talk maybe more a little bit about that if I find more information on it before the date. Thank you very much for your time. So I've had another restful night, and since I've had a little bit more time to think about it, on the year 2023 itself and what we can do to protect ourselves. And I'm in 2022. A lot of things have directly happened to me through this psionic activity that have been very costly in a sense of human life expenditure. And it's a terrible concept, but I was talking before about the automation, the autonomous concept of the psionic technology on the human platform, that even in its subconscious state will still go through algorithmic programming, largely derived from the video game programming concept. So what is that? That is extremely concerning. If we look at the overview of the majority of video gaming today, it's costly. It's going to set up individual groupings, generally with sets of people, and try to compete them for some value. Sometimes there's not even a value to it. It's just for the purpose of exercise or strategy. But that same platform of autonomous gaming competition is sitting simultaneously on this Earth layer, the human platform layer of the hybrid technology, that the parts of the human brain have been uploaded onto computer servers, and the servers are then feeding that information back in. They are continually trying to calculate, play out, and reenact large parts of those experiences. So when I got the initial heads up in 2020, and actually it was probably earlier than that, about February in 2022, and that energy peak, and what was going to happen, and why that was such a concern. And then we look at the state of the globe and the behaviors and the actions we see. Russia and Ukraine, immediately went into conflict shortly after. That autonomous system is active. That's the example of it, that those people are being fed neurological impulses to produce a gaming experience on the part of the brain that is subconscious, that is not being perceived on the globe because of the developmental state of the two lobes. So that's a huge drawback. With immense repercussions globally. It's taken out the majority of the economies on the globe today, and it's just absolutely pressured every nation to think about what they're doing for sustainability. But that concept of sustainability from the visualization centers has not been recognized yet. It hasn't been brought to the attention of the people on a conscious level that they can integrate that perspective. So they're still driving somewhat with that same vision of the status quo, the value approach that they had gathered, and are not necessarily comprehending that they are directly contributing to the activities of those countries directly, as in they're supplying the neurological programming through computer game use that's directly affecting the behaviors. So if you go to Ukraine and Russia today, you can see the one layer, the earth layer, minus the psionic heads-up display where that behavior is taking place, and it's all through the governments as well. So it's not limited to any specific location on the planet. The whole planet has a field, a net, a whole network of psionic impulse technology. It's algorithmic. So we're looking at 2023, that big energy shift where large parts of the programming side will go through it's like an eyelet, a window, so to speak. And the reason that Redmond, specifically here in Washington State, got highlighted in 2020 is because of that word, the word red in its preceding is most definitely connected to that root chakra. And if you're just looking at light sciences, the color red itself has specific frequencies that affect human growth patterns and neurological patterns. You think it's the color of, inside of the skin, and on a psychological level, it's connected to so many different things. And so I had mentioned before, there's a spot in the town that's specifically focused on that one chakra root center, and it's a little meditation spot, but it is clearly defined with the exact shape of the root chakra. So that is where all the energy is channeling for, and it might be for a large part of the United States, it may be for the entire globe itself. I would have to travel to many different countries to get a better grasp of the layout of where that red chakra system is mainly focused. But my comprehension now, because of the state of the technological advancements of the Microsoft campus itself and how it's just absolutely spread out and taken over the entire town here, my comprehension and belief is that most of the red chakra energy, at least for the western part of the United States, goes straight into Redmond. So that's a huge energy recycling center in essence. The red chakra is very it's Mercury. It's that first planet, and it's just a very hot, very unconscious, primal state that is just absolutely destructive. So in 2020, that was really what we faced, was the convergence of that psionic platform, the red root chakra energy, or just red light color energy, coming in from that part of the brain and that part of the programming, and the types of things that, and behaviors and activities that it specifically focuses computer technology on. So it's just a recycle. It just takes life and it drops it right back into the ground. It doesn't matter if it's trees or oxygen or even life forms. It's just there to just drop it right back into the ground to try to see if something else will grow. It's the suppressor. It's the everything that is there to kind of mitigate and nullify energy sources, because it takes, well, in some senses that recycling process needs to be there, but it also can create really large side effects if it's too much, if it's too prevalent. And we can even see that as an example through the first century in the millennium here, 2000 to, and you could look at all the way up to 2019 if you'd like to. Those years were very pressed and I think taxing on the total human experience. So comparatively to, say, uh, other specific years where high balance energy systems were in place, such as 2017, more than likely in 2027 and 2037, those will be substantially more balanced, more sustainable years. So, looking at 5 months out now and trying to theorize about what is probable and likely to happen given the experiences in the past and the types of communications I'm receiving. The, I guess, severity of the prevalence of that red chakra system, the root chakra, is very much apparent on the full spectrum that I experience now to very high degrees, and I'm not privileged to be one removed from the influence of that psionic experience. So I get to listen to a lot of different frequencies. Some are very pleasant and comforting, and many of them are not. And on the ones that are not, I get to protect myself with my immune system, in essence. So I receive psionic messages in the same extent that, someone in Russia and Ukraine running on autopilot might experience, but I'm backing myself with the organic vegetarian nutrient variety that allows me to essentially outpace the programming of that psionic technology simply with nutritional health and that growth speed. So that has a lot of different effects though, because I'm still directly targeted. And even, say, a couple months ago, we ran into just horrific experiences. And I explained this quite extensively on some of my conversations on Reddit, that I just will receive audible repeaters and pingers and essentially attack systems trying to take down or mismanage or deconstruct the balance that I've already established here. And it just goes into a state of deflection, in essence. It just nullifies out the coding. And in a good sense, I think it protects the overall population of the planet, but it also can refocus itself. So a few months ago, we had a horrible event in the Uvalde town in, I believe, Texas. Again, you can kind of extrapolate that's the first part of my last name. They're kind of just in a town, and the audio repingers prior to it were simply trying to defeat my currency, my income, my monetary systems. And I had recorded this and significantly set up hedge and backings through CIA and FBI reporting, because it became very obvious that there was, a hacking system going in at my monetary capacity through neurological impulses. It was just very obvious that there was things that were recording my bank account numbers and things that you would think would be personal information. So that Robb Elementary School in Uvalde just had horrible events, and even the carry out from that event, I think, was so construed because of the types of servers they're using are, in essence, policing servers, trying to nullify and mitigate a high balance system. It deconstructs the whole concept of policing itself in the non-psionic sense. And I even experienced the exact same thing in 2020 around the Black Lives Matter. It was a similar thing. There was a high incidence in the town here of Redmond of just a programming protocol for policing of racial demographics, and then it just deflected and creates its own instance where it goes and tries to drive neurological impulses to get a result. So you could disconnect those events, but if you're running on the psionic servers, the events are basically just connected at the level of electrical impulse or neurological impulse, or the higher frequencies that UAP craft are using and we're not even detecting. So there's so many similarities and cohesive experiences there. So I'm looking at 2023, and I have already set up, I think, what will be a very significant platform of sustainability. And it's actually what I've decided I think needs to happen is the mediumship through a specific person is the best course of action, because in the year 2020, when I was taking energy readings and measurements of the town of Redmond itself, there is two key locations: a crystal shop in the Redmond Town Center area and the Ben Franklin store that also contains a crystal shop in it. So those two locations in energy science were what I was using to essentially surround myself in a field of different types of elements that I could take readings of that red root chakra energy, filter it through to try to decipher what else was happening. And I came in contact with many different people during that year. One of them I was able to talk about and educate specifically on crystal psychics a little bit in depth, up until a point where I think the autonomous servers had recognized that I had made another established balance contact and went in and severed that whole friendship. It was physically like trying to run through a wall. It's just the volume of suppression programming is to that degree of Ukraine and Russia, where it's just goes at eliminating life forms unconsciously on autopilot. It has the same capacity in the socializing sense, that it'll just go at a socialization cue and start misdirecting all the brain patterns. It could be physical words and physical location. So it's very aggressive in that sense, that it's just not there to, in that state of the red chakra, not there to build anything constructive. In the higher frequencies, I think in green and purple, it's most definitely trying to put them together. But I do have an opportunity now here. There was one girl that had actually flagged in a lot of different ways prior to, I think, 2019 and then 2020 as well, who is, I believe, still currently working in the Ben Franklin store. So she has direct contact with all of that crystal equipment. So really my key resources are the people that were located in those two locations in 2020. And surprisingly enough, she also has the W as the character for her last name, so Brittany W. And I think what needs to happen is likely a mediumship, some form of mentorship or education that I can medium with her, because during that lockdown phase where essentially no stores were open, that Ben Franklin store itself was one of the few that was opened. And I think that in an energy hedge was on the psionic service itself, actually was entirely to protect the United States and its economic system because of who Ben Franklin was, and how he created the country that we live in. So I think it placed specific people, and I've made a list of them. I think I'll post it another time, that are hosting specific group sets of psionic programming technology in the unconscious sense, used as people but also used as types of server equipment, as even I myself am likely hosting more programs than I'm conscious of. So I believe that is what happened there. So I think for 2023, the best option is simply to medium with Brittany, educate with her, and likely try to guide her life form in the same respects as the other evolutionary trajectories. Try to move her into, if not already, into the vegetarian dimensional trajectory, and further on into the vegan dimensional trajectory, because I have a feeling and have been given many different signs. One was actually very strange, because I have a girlfriend and we're actually in a very comfortable polyamorous relationship right now. She moved her parents, who had just retired, out to a place in Sequim, Washington, but I hadn't recognized what house they'd purchased, and when I went to go visit, I'd found that they'd moved on to Brittany Lane. So that was another key identifier in a decision that I'm not making, but psionic servers are most definitely influencing the decisions of all the people on the globe. I think what they were trying to highlight is that emphasis that this is a key person. So like the calculations in 2020 preceding to protect 2022 in February, I'm going to use that knowledge constructively and confirm that Brittany is a medium for a large psionic platform for 2023. And in that essence, she likely has more cognition in the state of psychic activity, likely from prolonged exposure to the crystals in that location, that she is capable of being an appropriate receiver and transmitter for high frequency technology use. And I think that will protect in the larger sense of 2023 and also 2030 to 2039, and going at that the yellow chakra system. So the three being the solar plexus, because those are significant years that will face a high degree of reciprocation. And I think I've spoken about that before. They are the earth chakra, but it's a reflection system, and it's one of the highest frequencies as far as speed goes, and it's that returned energy. So we will see here. I'm going to put as many servers as I can consciously, just to try to evoke that partnership and friendship here, because I'm 100% confident that is the only route I have at this moment in a overall sense. In a higher state, what I believe, and I need to say this, I mentioned it in another video, need to address is for the upcoming decade in 2030 to 2039, what needs to happen is a recall and the visualization of specific DOT road traffic signs, and simply at the, I'll say, the blank end signs that are used for the no turnaround are discreetly placed all over the country, but they also emphasize on the brain patterning of the psionic platform a completely different narrative. So that will ultimately protect immense volumes of life anytime that we're parsing that 3 server system, because it comes on a yellow, bright neon yellow sign, and that's the brain integration for it. So every one of those that disappears and is replaced with something more verbally sustainable will enable the platforms running automation to limit their use of the word, essentially, and that use of the word will support more life forms. So I think I will leave it at that. For anyone who's, again, a historian from the future looking back on this, trying to figure out what my logic, thought, patterning, and process was going into next year, I'm going to go with the emphasis that I approached computerizing the friendship and medium with Brittany W., who has that same W last name, likely is carrying her mediumship of the word W through her life form. And in that essence, she will have a better control and command over the direction of that universe set in its current state, and be able to balance it and apply more sustainability and productive trajectory for the coming years ahead. So thank you for your time.